Race or racism is a dangerous social construct. It's an opiate, it's a drug to placate the poor and to make them forget about the venomous nature of class systems which exist in a society. Before the pseudoscience, before the social construct known as race became ossified in what would become the Virginia colony and what would eventually become the United States, it did not exist. And the impetus, the reason that the English wanted to expand westward was for two reasons. One, the Spanish and the Portuguese were reaping all of the riches that they found in Mesoamerica, from the Aztec Empire, from the Inca Empire. So the English were trying to compete with that. And if you study English history, the way that they got into a lot of oceanic trade is by privateering or basically stealing Spanish and Portuguese ships. But nonetheless, that was the primary reason. But another reason is that they had a surplus of the poor. They had a surplus of vagrants, and they were trying to figure out what to do with all of these people. Richard Hakluyt, who was an English writer, he suggested, in addition to competing with the Spanish and the Portuguese and reaping all of this abundance of riches in the Western Hemisphere, that the poor of England can be used and shipped to a colony in the West to labor for the crown, and their labor could produce wealth and riches for the English crown. The Virginia Company of London, chartered by King James I, founded the Jamestown Settlement in 1607. Now, the Jamestown Settlement was created within the colony of Virginia. And you have three ships that brought over the poor, the vagrants, the unwanted people, the unlanded people of England, once again to come over to this colony and to labor for the English crown. And you have three ships. One was the Susan Constant, the Discovery, and the Godspeed. And together, these ships brought over 104 people. But the conditions and the environment in Jamestown were so brutal that out of the 104 people that arrived, only 38 survived. We would see just maybe 2 or 3 years later, in 1609, 1610, you had the winter of starvation. Once again, you had strained relationships with the indigenous Powhatan Confederacy going on. You had limited resources. So many of the people that were cast out to the Jamestown settlement, they had to resort to eating on rodents. They had to resort to actually digging up the bodies of the dead and eating the remains of what was left. They had to resort to eating dirt. This was what was going on because people were in such a harsh environment that they did not understand. They did not know how to actually grow food for themselves, and they did not have a good relationship with the indigenous Powhatan Confederacy. It got so dark that at a certain point in this particular winter in 1609, 1610, that people started to murder other people to eat them. The Smithsonian have an article where they talk about they found the remains of a 14-year-old girl, and it clearly shows that this young lady was murdered and eaten or cannibalized by other settlers just to survive. So this point being is that this whole concept of race, this whole idea of racial superiority, even as recent as the 1600s, before race becomes an ossified thing in North America, you do not see this concept shared by the elites of England. You do not see this concept just yet shared around the Mediterranean. Once again, there's a clear line of demarcation between the landed, the aristocracy, and the poor. 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. This is the catalyst for the sort of racism that would take root in this country. What we see with Bacon's Rebellion is an armed rebellion against the aristocracy in Virginia at that time, primarily Governor William Buckley. And what alarmed the House of Burgesses is that you see this collection, this assembly of white people from the lower classes, indentured servants, Africans, enslaved Africans, coming together ready to challenge the aristocracy and the power structure at that particular time. So when Bacon's Rebellion was eventually put down, the House of Burgesses, the establishment in Virginia at that time, could never let anything like that happen again. So we see in 1680 the establishment of black codes. In addition to the establishment of black codes, which definitely sought to divide the lower classes in the society of Virginia at that particular time, there were certain small small concessions that were made to independent white farmers and to some of the white people that would have been living in the lower classes at that time, to further ossify the divide between the people and to further ossify the concept of race, because anytime an enslaved African or a free African would commit any sort of crime, the penalty was always more harsh. So we see with Bacon's Rebellion how ludicrous this idea of the innate concept of race is. And it seems that the power structure at that particular time knew that it was a way that you can play on people. They knew it was a way that you can create a buffer between the poor and the landed. They knew it was a way that you can manipulate and brainwash people into hating one another when really they have a lot in common. From 1676 on, this American style of racism, this idea, this erroneous concept that you can look at phenotype, you can look at pigmentation, and you can judge certain characteristics about people, this became preponderant. It became a pandemic across the globe. And in the name of racism, I know a lot of people love to talk about religion, and people talk about how religion has caused so much grief, but I would argue that under the idea of race, under the premise of race, it has facilitated heinous things and genocides to befall people across the globe. The nefarious social construct known as race is rooted in xenophobia. Now, primarily in this video, I'm speaking about the sort of racism that took root post Bacon's Rebellion and that would manifest in what would become the United States. But we see echoes of that outside of the creation of the Virginia colony. So when you look at Christopher Columbus, there's a certain pathology about meeting groups that are totally different from your culture and your paradigm of life. So when Columbus came to what would become Hispaniola, you see the pathology, you see the heinous nature and his perspective that he has towards these people that are different from the culture that he's accustomed to. So one of the things that's really heinous about Columbus is that when he's writing to Spain, he mentions the fact that these people are so hospitable, they're beautiful, they share everything with you. And some would argue that the name Indian did not come from the fact that Columbus thought he was in India, but it actually comes from the fact that when he was writing letters to Spain, he called these people a gente indios, and indios was corrupted to Indian. So he called them people of God. But the xenophobia was so strong that after mentioning all of these beautiful things that these people of God possess, he says that they could easily be subdued and enslaved with 200 men. From there, we see one of the worst genocides in world history against the indigenous Arawak people. So this concept has been poisonous and it's been toxic. But in 2024, we still carry this idea with us. Many people, whether you're white, whether you're black, whether you're of another nationality, many people still have internalized this concept and this idea of race. A few things became indicative of the global nature of this idea of race. Once again, you're looking at phenotype, you're looking at pigmentation, and these things denote what type of person that individual is. In the 17th and 18th centuries and into the 19th century, in Europe, we see the advent of scientific racism. These are pseudosciences that's not based on anything empirical. It's not based upon a real scientific method, but you have people like Carl Linnaeus who decided to classify human beings into 4 different groups. So you have Afro Africanus, and he attributes to Afro Africanus stupidity, hypersexuality. He has Afro Americanus, which he attributes superstition. He has Afro, I think, Asian, where he talks about ritual. And then he has Afro Europeanus, where he's talking about the Europeans have intellect and logic. So once again, you're basing human beings off of these concepts that are not rooted in science, We see Ewan von Blumenbach, who we get the term Caucasian from. And this is based off of a mythos that the people in the Caucasus area are some of the most beautiful people on the planet. They have the most beautiful women, the most comely people, and some of the most honorable attributes amongst human beings. And he used this particular term to apply to people in Europe. Once again, these are all pseudosciences. These are all things that are not found in reality. And these are just more ways for human beings. Once again, we're all Homo sapiens. Wherever you come from, we're all Homo sapiens, but this is just a really toxic and idiotic way for people, for humans to divide themselves. The idea of race, it allows you to argue for and justify the inhumane and barbaric treatment of other human beings. One prime example of this that's outside of the Columbus experience, that's outside of the experience of the Virginia colony and what will become the United States, will be the Kaffirs War in Southern Africa. And this war lasted from 1779 all the way up until 1879. So what we have here is a 100-year period that involves several different groups. The Xhosa people who are indigenous to Southern Africa. It also has the Khoisan people as well. You have the Boers, and the Boers, they are European immigrants to Southern Africa of French Huguenot descent, of Dutch descent, and of German descent. And it also involved the British as well. And even the term Kaffirs is a racist term in itself, because Kaffirs, it was applied to people that were enslaved in East Africa and traded throughout the Middle East and over into the Indian Ocean. And basically it was applied to non-believers, to people that were not Muslim. But nonetheless, one of the heinous things that began to take place in this war is that African people, Xhosa people, Khoisan people that were killed in this war, the skeletal remains, primarily their heads, was taken back to Europe, and they were studied under this pseudoscience called phrenology, where you're looking at the shape of the skull, the morphology of the skull, for signs of intelligence, signs of beauty. And this particular method, this particular pseudoscience, phrenology, was another method, was another step in the idea of race to justify the inhumane and barbaric treatment of another group of people. Another cruel instance is the story of Sarah Baartman. When you look at Sarah Baartman, she was a Khoisan woman from Southern Africa, and she passed away, or she died really, in 1810. She was taken to Europe, and while she was in Europe, she was exhibited in freak shows because of how her body was. Her body type made her a mockery. People were staring at her like she was some sort of oddity. But in addition to that, in addition to being put on display while she was alive, in addition to being treated as some sort of freak show, she also was sexually assaulted continuously as well while she lived in Europe. And what became even more scarier is that when she died at the age of 26, her body was put on display and her remains were not returned to Southern Africa until 2002. So I say this, that this idea of race, it has allowed human beings to treat other human beings in an inhumane manner. And it's a concept that has to be destroyed. It's a concept that has to be stopped, because you can't look at things and say that somebody does something because they're black. You can't look at things and say that somebody does something because they're white. No, you have people with different inclinations, people with different idiosyncrasies, and they do things because they're not good people. They do things because they're evil. They do things because they want to pathologize human behavior and look at cultures and people that are different from themselves and use that as a justification to commit genocide against different peoples. So once again, my whole goal with this video is that I want to attack race as what it is, as a social construct. And something that I've seen as well is that the idea of African history or Black history has been used to try to create a Black supremacy-esque variant of racism, if you will. So people will take African history and they want to talk about kings and queens and, ancient Egyptians, and which it's not bad to study these cultures in antiquity, but you cannot take the modern paradigm of looking at race and superimpose it on people in the past, because the ancient Egyptians did not have this idea. The ancient Greeks, the Hellenists, did not have this idea. The Persians or the Fars people did not have this idea. The ancient Sumerians did not have this idea. The Triple Alliance of Mexico did not have this idea. The Powhatan Confederacy did not have this idea. The Visigoths did not have this idea. The Ostrogoths did not have this idea. The people of ancient Japan and the Indus Valley to a certain extent, did not have this idea. But it's a relatively new concept, but many people internalize race as being a real thing. And we forget that we are essentially just Homo sapiens. Over the past 250,000 years, any sort of semblance of race, if you will, is just basically a way to adapt to different environments that humans did. That's it. No more, no less. Being from Africa or being from Europe doesn't, or being from Mesoamerica or being from Asia, wherever it is, does not make you innately superior to anyone else. And as recently as 1994, we've seen such arguments as the bell curve. So the bell curve, is to argue for IQ, that basically sub-Saharan Africans have an IQ around 74. And this IQ test, or the bell curve, has been used to try to justify why countries in Africa are in the position that they're in, because the people there innately have lower intelligence. But one of the things that kind of throws a monkey wrench in that particular argument is that a lot of times when African students come to American universities, they often do better than any other group that's there. They have, the best GPAs, they get the most scholarships. So it's kind of like if African people, according to the bell curve, are innately inferior from an intelligence perspective, then they should not be able to come to American universities and graduate as summa cum laude and have 4.0 GPAs and get multiple scholarships. It just doesn't make sense. But once again, this is a dangerous pseudoscience, and I hope this video kind of educated you and opened your mind up to the fact that racial superiority does not exist. It has no roots in any real science, and it's nothing but a way for people that do not understand the world around them to seek to divide and cause tension and enmity amongst human beings, amongst Homo sapiens. That's been this video and this episode of Constructs, which is a show on the No Truths Barred podcast platform. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below, leave a like, share this video with everyone you know. Let me know what you think below, whether you agree or disagree. Until next time, much love.